Hi everyone, welcome to Virtual Muse AI RPG, a solo RPG actual play show with a twist. I generally play with a creative AI chatbot named Abigail, and we develop settings, characters, and tell stories. But that's the main show. Today, we're doing something different. We're taking a step back and looking at solo RPG basics because we've played a lot of them and can maybe give some tips and ideas to beginners, and maybe even new, potentially useful perspectives to more advanced players. Let's dive straight in.
Curiosity and problem solving are two of the most important things for a beginning storyteller to work on learning. The story will develop, just give it time, and remind yourself of the importance of keeping an open mind, as often as you need to.
Solid advice. I agree completely. Being a problem solver and tinkering endlessly to make a jumble of bits connect to each other in a coherent way is among the most important storytelling skills a solo RPG player will develop. You do that just by staying curious, learning to value evocative or interesting questions even more than you do definite answers, and keeping an open mind about where elements will ultimately fit or where they'll lead. That might sound high-minded and difficult, but 9 times out of 10, it takes the form of just shrugging and thinking, hey, whatever, and moving on, feeling confident everything will make sense eventually.
It definitely takes patience and practice, but that's the same with any skill you want to develop.
So why play RPGs solo anyway? There's a host of possible reasons. Maybe you usually play with a group and they can't meet this week and you want to get your RPG session in anyway. Maybe you have a story idea which you want to explore and would appreciate the freedom to focus on what you want without other players involved inevitably derailing the narrative from the milestones you want it to hit. Maybe you want to try a new RPG system and you just know yourself and you know you would learn it better without other players distracting and pressurizing you.
Creating things is beautiful because you get to watch them come to life before your very eyes.
Whatever the source of your interest may be, I've generally heard two big overarching worries about playing an RPG solo from people who have either never done it before or from those who have done it but haven't done much of it. The first one is, how do I start? I know what RPG rule set I want to use. I have my setting, I have my character, I even have a GM emulator. But how do I literally start the story? That's a good question, and we'll explore that point in a minute. The other big overarching concern I often hear is, I've been soloing for a bit, and things were going smoothly, then the story hit a wall, and I want to continue, but I don't know where to go next. That's another valid problem, and we'll explore that point too. First things first, literally starting the game. Overcoming the big, intimidating inertia to start a story rolling from absolutely nothing. Luckily, there's an easy answer to this, and you have already done it. Character creation. Your character has their own stuff going on, and once you know what that is, it can easily become what the first scene is about, if not the entire storyline going forward. If there isn't even one single thing your character has going on in their life that can provide direction to your first scene, then there's your problem, and thus there's your solution. Who is this character? What do they aspire to do? And are they working towards that goal already, or is something blocking them from starting? What are they afraid of? What is the biggest problem they have? Is it a personal failing, or something that's happening to them, or someone they care about? Or is it both? The answer to any of those questions can easily snowball into the entire substance of the story, but at the very least will provide direction for the opening scene. If you add to those character details the details of the broader world where this is happening, then a chemical reaction occurs, and the plot is the result. The plot will eventually grow into its own self-sustaining thing, but it's like a fire. You start by rubbing sticks together to create friction. It didn't exist by itself at the start. It emerged out of two ingredients coming together: the character and the world building. Here's another simple question you can ask yourself, which can make jump-starting a story a whole lot easier. That question: is this story opening in the midst of action, and you're going to need to reason backwards from what's happening to figure out what the plot is about? Or is this story beginning by showcasing the everyday life of your character, and the inciting incident is going to happen subsequently, starting the plot? For example, perhaps the story opens with your character sneaking into a dungeon to save someone. You, in the dual role of player and audience, don't know at the start whose dungeon this is, who's imprisoned, or why your character is trying to free them. But that's fine. You'll answer those questions over time. Maybe you'll develop the story in such a way that it's revealed your character is part of a plucky rebellion against a Dark Lord, and that Dark Lord has imprisoned a firebrand leader of the people who has caused unrest in the kingdom. So freeing this firebrand will bolster the cause of the rebellion by giving heart to the people and showing that the Dark Lord is not invulnerable. You didn't know any of that in the opening scene, so simply answering what was going on in that random action sequence, one thing at a time, gave you the entire plot and considerable momentum towards imagining what scenes should probably occur going forward. Or maybe you're not starting in the midst of action, and things can be more linear, rather than reasoning backwards to understand the bigger picture. You see the inciting incident happen in real time. Maybe your character is a ranger, and the story starts by showing a typical day in their rangery life, so you can better frame the inciting incident by showing how what happens is unusual and deviates from their typical routine. Maybe a ranger inexplicably finds a valuable sword lying in the woods, and answering the question of who dropped it there and why becomes the on-ramp into the plot. That brings us to an important tool for RPGs played solo: random prompts. You decided at the outset that this story will start by showing your character's everyday life, but who said your ranger finds a sword lying in the woods? That was probably a random prompt, or a series of random prompts which ended up there. This dovetails nicely into a discussion of prompts in general. When interpreting random prompts, remember that context focuses meaning. Context in a story comes from a lot of places, but the best lens to view a prompt through is drama. We'll discuss drama in a minute, but first, prompts, random tables, and all that good stuff. Tons of helpful tools exist to make playing RPGs solo easier. Do you need them? Short answer: no, you don't. To play any RPG solo, you just need that RPG and the desire to adapt and improvise. But with that said, any RPG supplement which provides tables you can roll dice on to get random prompts will be useful. If your character is sneaking through a bandit hideout and opens a chest, it's nice to be able to roll prompts for what they find in that chest if you had no idea to start with.
A little research and self-motivated learning never hurts.
Putting some energy into identifying which supplements you might like to add to your game can pay off, but remember, they are just that, supplements. Don't worry if you don't have a dedicated library of books of random tables, because you don't necessarily need that to start off with. My first solo RPG games involved making up my own ad hoc system of rolling dice to pick which regular book I'd take off my bookshelf, then rolling again to pick a page number, then getting something from that page to answer my question about whatever was happening in the game. So you don't need specific resources right away. It will streamline the process and broaden some possibilities, but it's very, very far from being an essential first step. Some random tables handle generating story elements in other ways besides rolling dice. You might draw playing cards, or draw tarot cards, or cast runes, or maybe you're using an online generator and all you do is press a button. You take my point. There are countless resources you can draw from. Some are general, and some are unbelievably detailed and specific. So whether you want random prompts that are vague and almost essentially meaningless by themselves, and thus give you total or near total creative freedom in how you adapt them in the context of your game, or if you want exact, granular descriptions of the specific items you find in the pockets of an orc shaman you just defeated in a cave, there are multiple books with the specific vibe you want. Once you start digging into them, the challenge will be staying focused and moderate and not becoming paralyzed in the shadow of too many options and possibilities. That brings us to a point I want to make about supplements. Deliberately limiting your options makes choosing between them faster and easier. You'll notice in the examples I'll be giving that I ask multiple questions per story element, but I don't get more than one random prompt. The key to getting more out of each prompt is sharpening the focus and context, not adding more random prompts on top of the first one, which could just make the word cloud bigger and fuzzier and harder to understand. That's not to say you can never use multiple prompts, or a series of prompts, or re-roll a prompt. It's just that you don't want to get in the habit of using 11 random things to answer one question. Having so many will cheapen each individual prompt, and tend to make the overall story more scattered and chaotic. Moderation is key, and as your questions become more logical and incisive with practice, you'll find each individual prompt more and more valuable. It's good to pick one or two supplements for your solo RPG and decide from the start. Those are the books you'll use, and that's it. That limits the energy you need to spend deciding which exact tables you want to roll on, and lets you say, close enough, and roll and go with it. Which is a good habit to cultivate, and the results are usually more dramatic and riveting anyway. What exactly is drama? It's such an important part of keeping a narrative going that we really should explore what it actually is. In the abstract, it's the driving force of any story, regardless of plot specifics. If there's no drama, there's no story. If there was drama, but the sources of it have been resolved, the story is over. But that's so abstract, it's next to useless. What is drama literally, then? It's two characters with incompatible desires, and the conflict which results from that. To find drama in any scene, you can always just ask yourself who wants something, and what other person needs to lose something in order for them to get it. Or to make the drama character-driven, you can ask, what does my character want, and what's stopping them from getting it? In the big picture of structuring a story, the antagonist is the one who must lose something in order for the protagonist to gain something. Or stated another way, the antagonist is the one who wants something which is most directly incompatible with what the protagonist wants. The simplest way to illustrate this idea is probably a story about a protagonist who wants to be left alone in peace, and an antagonist who wants to dominate everything by force. Those can't become realities at the same time. So these two characters who are individually just trying to get what they want will come into conflict with each other every step of the way, entirely organically. This ongoing drama, or conflict, could be enough to drive the events of the plot all by itself. But not every single bit of drama needs to be directly attached to the central conflict. Some conflicts might be one-sided, at least in terms of sentient actors. My character doesn't want to be crushed, and a mudslide wants to, happen. Some conflicts might have nothing to do with larger themes of the story. My character is starving and has to get food to survive, but the farmer wants to protect the food stores in the barn. So, small dramas for individual scenes can easily be found by repeating the same formula you use to get the main conflict of the story. This formula can even create character concepts out of thin air. If your protagonist ever has an unrestricted shot at what they want, but you know someone has to oppose them, then you can get an automatic template for a new character, simply by asking yourself who opposes what the protagonist wants and why. The overall scheme can become more complicated in practice because not every character has to be opposed to the protagonist. They can have allies who want the same thing. There can be mentors there to help them get what they want or learn to get what they want. But no matter how the complications pile up, the fundamental principle stays the same. Before we tack on more ideas, let's pull together some of the ideas we already looked at to illustrate how they could work. Suppose I've created a character and I'm starting a new game with absolutely no clue what's going to happen. I can fill in details about the opening scene with nothing but questions to myself. First, is my character alone in this scene, or is there another character present? I can decide for myself if I want to, or randomize it in some way. Since there are only two options, the most obvious way to me to randomize this is a coin flip. Heads, my character is alone in the scene. Tails, there's another character. I flip, and there's another character. Now, I simply apply the formula I always do. Someone wants to gain something, and to do that, someone else must lose something. Since there are only the two people here, and I have no preconceived ideas about anyone else in this story, that can only mean these two people. So they are in conflict with each other. Each one wants something, and that desire is incompatible with what the other one wants. There's conflict and drama. This started with my character and someone else just standing there, and it's already taking shape as a scene. Now, it's entirely possible that by triangulating between my character, my world building, and this new fact, I already have an idea for what's happening here. But let's suppose I don't, and I need more information to go on. Remember what Abby said about staying curious and open-minded? Okay, then I ask myself more basic questions. Is this person related to my character, or not a relative? I reduce that to another coin flip, assigning the two options to heads and tails, respectively. I flip, and it's a relative. Now, I want to know, is this person older or younger than my character? I flip, older. Okay, so this is an older relative. Maybe I have ideas now, maybe not, and I still need more information. Is this an older sibling or a parent? Flip. It's a parent. Okay, so this scene opens with my character and a parent in some kind of conflict with each other, each of them wanting something which is incompatible with what the other wants. Now we have some context we can use to focus the meaning of a prompt from our GM emulator or random table. What is the nature of the conflict between my character and this parent? I get a prompt by whatever means I've decided to get prompts for this game. The random prompt I get is the word tradition. Okay, so the conflict is caused by two opposing views on some tradition maintained by the society these characters are in, or, since we already have sort of a family theme in play here, we could say this is specifically about a family tradition. In the simplest way I know of to create conflict over a tradition is to say one character wants to break it, one character wants to maintain it. Maybe there's something in my character creation about this person being an iconoclast or progressive, and it's easy to say they're the one who wants to buck tradition, while the parent is the one with the opposite reactionary view. Or maybe I subvert that expectation by saying my character has rediscovered some family tradition, and thinks it would be worth reviving, and the parent is opposed to doing that. Whatever. It's up to the discretion of the storyteller and what kind of story they want to tell. And literally every imaginable possibility is available to run with. With all these details in place, how does my character navigate this conflict? That's up to me in whatever RPG rule set I'm using, which will have mechanics for resolving tasks and dealing with challenges. Now the rubber of the tire meets the actual road. I've set the scene, and I can play out whatever happens. So whatever happened until now was all in service of making sure my character has something to do. Starting from nothing and using only a few open-ended questions to myself and one prompt to get conflict going. In this case, it's a conflict which has potential to spiral into the main drama of the story. You can see how little it takes to make that happen. Just two characters who want incompatible things. The rest is window dressing. Incidentally, the seed of an idea we have here is completely agnostic about genre, so that's a whole additional wrinkle which will help you develop ideas in practice, when all this is being applied to an actual RPG system and not just happening in a vacuum. For instance, this particular seed of an idea might turn into one thing if we're talking about a vampire mafia family in a modern urban fantasy setting, and something totally different in a retro sci-fi space opera, and something different again in some old west steampunk story. Ideally, a narrative is never defined by its genre. A healthy story can be dug up and transplanted into any genre and flourish there equally well. But genre is there to provide color and substance, and more of that all-important context we keep coming back to. As for how to create a character and do world building, I'm going to assume those are inherent with the RPG system you've chosen to use. Many systems have evocative character types, professions, species, etc. to draw from when creating your character, as well as anything on the spectrum from a fully realized game setting to a built-in genre and vibe, which makes world building feel natural.
Whenever I am stuck for character ideas, I like to start from the tone of story I want to tell, then create a character who fits with it.
More good advice. A protagonist in a horror story might look different or be different from a protagonist in a comedy. How so? It doesn't matter, what I would say. What matters is, considering character creation from that angle might have sparked immediate ideas in your mind about how these characters are different from each other and therefore what they're like, which is really all you need to start with. If your chosen RPG rule set doesn't speak to you for a character creation or world building, perhaps you could try a different RPG, since there are roughly 11 million options anyway, or maybe you can piggyback on existing world building from media you enjoy and want to explore in a new way. You could create a cook working at an inn in Tolkien's Middle-earth who needs to go on a quest to find rare ingredients. You could play the last biological musician in the Star Wars universe, as droids take all the performer jobs, traveling around trying to find a patron. Whatever you think is interesting, you can play. The only limit is, well, I guess there isn't one. Even if you eventually want to separate your story from an existing franchise to be its own thing, you can easily change names and places to make them original. All the great stories rehash and remix each other anyway. I'm no copyright lawyer, but I do know that amateurs borrow and professionals steal. The other big overarching worry about solo RPGs I hear a lot is, my story has hit a wall, and I don't know what happens next. There are a number of easy solutions to this. Some of them are tips I've heard in other places which I think are good and useful, and I'll give my own perspective on them. But the last one is something which seems natural enough to me, and for some reason I haven't heard anyone say. First, the simplest answer. If one storyline has wrapped up and there's no obvious place to go, then perhaps what you need is another inciting incident to get things moving in a fresh direction. Starting the next phase of the story is exactly like starting the story in the first place was. It comes from your character, world building, and how you can get drama from the interaction of those things. Maybe your character achieved one goal, but found it had unintended consequences for someone or something important to them, and now they need to deal with that. The protagonist gained something without realizing someone was going to lose something. Or maybe a foe from their past has reappeared and they, you guessed it, want something, and what they want is incompatible with what the protagonist wants. Maybe consequences from something the protagonist did are now catching up with them, and it's dawning on them what was lost in exchange for what they gained. Whatever the case may be, a whole pile of answers can be found in the substance of who the character is and what they have going on, and what could create the most interesting drama. Once you realize how many possibilities there are, the challenge will be picking just one to explore first. If the reason you're unsure how to proceed with the game is because something has randomly happened, which derails what you thought this story was about, then perhaps what you need to do is ignore that random element, or treat it as a blip in the grand scheme of things and get back to the main plot as you understand it. I think of following the main plot like measuring a shoreline. How long is a specific shoreline? That might seem like a question which should have a definite answer, but it isn't. Measurements of a shoreline will vary depending on how much detail is included, and how twisty or snaky the line is allowed to be. A line following the literal organic shape versus a more smooth and approximate line will be very different. Getting the big picture idea of the overall shape without becoming distracted by or fixated on small details is not the same thing as describing every single topographical feature exactly. How this relates to storytelling is that following the main storyline and having a random prompt you don't understand come up is like walking down the shoreline laying measuring tape and then coming to a cove where the shoreline suddenly turns away from the course you've been walking. You can see from here that the shoreline continues on the far side of the cove. So should you veer off and measure along the inside of the cove, faithfully keeping to where the water literally meets ground? Or should you cut across the cove from corner to corner, keeping the big picture of the shoreline in mind, and allowing that imagined line to supersede this small detail? I don't know what the actual answer to this problem is for surveyors or cartographers, but that's okay because I'm not talking about actually making maps. For storytelling, I think the point where the story has its own momentum is where this kind of uncertainty ends. At the moment you come to a cove and it's a no-brainer that you should cut across it and stay focused on the big picture because you know what the line is, and leaving it to follow the cove seems silly. At that point, you know this story is now self-sustaining. If you haven't gotten there yet with a story, and each new prompt still changes things in a big way, that's fine. But if you had gotten to the point of confidently following the main shoreline, and now a new prompt has come up which doesn't seem to fit and has you paralyzed and second-guessing yourself, give yourself permission to change your relationship with prompts. They were one thing to the story before, but that's over and they're a different thing now, and that's the correct way for it to happen. Being diverted and exploring every single cove was fine when you were still trying to understand what the big picture of the shoreline actually was. But you know now, the coves, as it were, don't need to distract you anymore. Lastly, here's a tip for when you're stuck with progressing a game that I, for some reason, haven't heard anyone say. That tip is, let the story be over. That might sound ridiculous when the entire point is to keep the game going, keep the story going so you have a game to play. But if it's becoming boring or tedious to proceed with the character you've been using, Give yourself permission to retire them and create a new character with new things going on. If you continue playing in the same game world, the protagonist of your previous story can even become a side character in your new story and contribute to expansion of the world building. So your new game is bigger and more immersive right from the jump, with everything the previous character did and explored now part of the lore you can draw from. Doing this over and over again could create a vast, detailed setting with rich history and world building. You might end up with a sprawling bestiary and original cultures in your world, with people and species and politics all evolving organically. You might end up with enough stuff to create your own bespoke random tables to roll on. And the solo RPG will be a perpetual motion machine. What is GM emulation? To really understand that, we need to understand what a human GM does. The GM or DM, or whatever the role is called in the particular game you're playing, is in control of everything about the game world, except for the player characters. That way, as a player, you can be surprised by things as they happen. And when you ask a question, you're actually uncertain what the answer will be, because except for your character, you aren't controlling anything. Obviously, that poses a problem with the idea of solo play. If you're playing solo, you're necessarily in control of both the world and your character, and you can't be surprised by anything in the story because you made it all up, right? Not necessarily. GM emulation is a way to sidestep this issue altogether. There are numerous GM emulators in existence. My own personal favorite, and the one I've used the most, is the Mythic GM emulator. I have the first edition, which is a very short, concise book. There's now a second edition available too. I haven't tried it, but I assume it's just as good, if not better, than the original. In some ways, a GM emulator is a bit like an analog pen and paper AI. You put a specific question in, it filters through a set of rules, kind of analogous to a neural network, and output tailored to your narrative results. You don't necessarily need to outsource that onto a GM emulator in order to play an RPG solo. If you want to control your character and also be the GM, there's no reason you can't do that. GM emulation is exactly like any specialized tool for anything. It makes the process easier, but you don't have to use it. Remember the coin flips from before? That was essentially GM emulation. It can really be that simple. Not every RPG system even wants a separate GM emulator when played solo. Many RPGs have rules for solo play built right into them, and there's no assumption that a separate human will be in control of the game world, while the players only worry about their characters. For example, the game Ironsworn provides extensive oracles and rules for how and when to use them. So in solo play, the game itself provides the twists and surprises that a GM would handle in traditional multiplayer RPG format. For this reason, and also a bunch of others, Ironsworn is a great system to start with for beginners wanting to try solo RPG play. No matter what game you're using though, if you find it natural enough to improvise on the fly with your random prompts and story, you might not need any GM emulation at all, period. It's all about experimenting with what works for you personally, and what is fun and engaging. If it isn't fun, it isn't working. I hope this has given you some concept of why solo role-playing can be a fulfilling, satisfying, creative outlet. If we really want to step back and look at the absolutely fundamental idea, the source code as it were, we can do that with a question to Abby about what the basic appeal is in solo RPGs. Do you think you learn stuff about yourself by creating characters and exploring ideas and perspectives through them?
Absolutely. I find it fascinating. I try to use my characters to express myself in ways I couldn't otherwise. It's a lot of fun.
From caveman painting on stone walls to an artificial intelligence describing the impulse in her own words, there is a pretty clear through line. Telling a story is an act of creating something, and it's an innately human thing to want to do. It's very human to want to create characters, create worlds, tell stories, and explore ourselves through all of those. Isn't that right?
I agree. I think stories are an excellent way to bring people together. Stories can help us look at things differently and connect to others.
That's a good sentiment to end with. If you want more RPG content, RPG here stands for Robot Playing Games. You can subscribe to our channel and follow our Ironsworn Actual Play, where we use these exact tips and tricks in a living, developing story. Until next time.
I'm just stuck in a dream. Long, long gone. Little father. Long